Hello, you're listening to For All the Saints with me, Paul Sutton. And look, I'm not even trying anymore to try and get one of these out every week. There's lots going on as we come to the actual launch of All Saints Church in Exeter, which our soft launch is on the 11th of August. We'll have 3 Sundays just sort of ironing things out while people are on holiday as well. And then, Lord willing, on the 1st of September will be our so-called hard launch, where hopefully things will be roughly as we hope them to be going forwards. And yeah, really exciting to be getting to that stage, but also a busy time. But I didn't want to drop this series. I've got through a few episodes on tithing, and I promised another one on the Freewill offering, and that's what I'm hoping to talk about today. Before I get to that though, let me just say a few more things about tithing, which either I wished I'd said before, or I've had conversations since those episodes that have made me think a little bit further about it. The first thing is that the tithe in the Old Testament, and I guess by extension in the whole Bible, is never enforced by law. You can never get fined or imprisoned or stoned or whatever for it. No, although it's mandatory and obligatory, it's never enforced. At least it's not enforced by men. I guess what that means is that it's not actually a matter of church discipline. It may be something that in a church has a membership with a certain commitment that you make when becoming a member, that you promise to support the church financially in some way. Even in the Church of England, that's a kind of implicit expectation at least. But it's not a matter of church discipline whether or to what extent someone tithes. I think that's an eminently sensible thing. But let me say also that it doesn't mean that the tithe is not enforced. As I've been trying to say through this whole series, the tithe is enforced by God, both positively and negatively. Book of Malachi, to come back to it once again, God was saying to the people of Israel, bring the full tithe into the storehouse and see what I'm going to do. The sufferings and privations that they were undergoing seemingly were because they were not honouring the Lord with their wealth. And conversely, those who do honour the Lord with their wealth are surprised, maybe even uncomfortable by how the Lord promises to bless them materially as well as spiritually in response. I also forgot to say a few more things. I know the last episode was kind of technical, but I do think it has to be once you say that the tithe as a tenth is obligatory, because you've got to be able to say, well, hang on, what does a tenth actually mean? What does it mean for somebody who is on the higher rate of tax and all the rest of it? One thing I forgot to mention in that was, how do you factor in something like inflation? Obviously, inflation is targeted to run at 2% and supposedly it runs at something around that. But if there's nothing else which can clearly be seen as the locusts which get to the olives before you get to them, then inflation certainly is that. Similarly, I didn't mention things like student loans and other kind of tax complications. I honestly have no idea how you factor those things in. I just want to say, 1, that you do need to make that calculation. 2, that you don't need to fuss too much about it, but you do need to take it seriously. And 3, that what we're striving to do is not to say, how little can I give to the Lord, but how can I honour him with my wealth? Which I think brings us on nicely to the topic of free will offerings. In the Bible, in Christian living, we have this idea that there are things which are good to do, but they're not mandatory to do. Not everybody has to do them. Sometimes people feel a lot of pressure in these areas because they're good, and people sometimes rhetorically make them feel like, you know, if you were a good Christian, you would be doing it. So I think, for example, of fostering or adopting children. What an incredible thing that is to do. What a huge cost it is to those who do it, and a blessing as well. It's a good thing to do. It's something that is very fitting with what God has done for us. And it's right and natural that Christians would think, if the Lord has been so gracious to us, let me show just a measure of that graciousness towards those kids who are in great need as well. It's a good thing, and yet it is not a mandatory thing. If you're not fostering, you just don't have to feel guilty that you're not. Let me give another example. It says in 1 Timothy chapter 3, the man who aspires to the office of an elder desires a good thing. Now, that doesn't mean that every man needs to aspire to the office of an elder. I think when you read down the list of things in 1 Timothy chapter 3, I think they're things that every Christian man ought to want to be, in terms of their character, above reproach, husband of one wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, all the rest of it. I suppose every man ought to have the aspiration to at least have a good enough understanding of the gospel, a sound enough grasp of it that they are able to teach at some level. And yet nobody has to want to be an elder. It's fine not to be. Similarly, I suppose in a different setting with the pictures that often come across calling people to overseas missionary work. A great thing to do, and yet you don't have to do them. I would even say this about attendance at church. I want to say, maybe this is my kind of recent Presbyterian convictions growing, although I don't think this is actually distinct from what Anglicans are supposed to believe too. When it says in the scriptures, don't give up meeting together, and then piecing it all together, that is specifically talking about the weekly, first day of the week, Sunday gathering of the church. I think if somebody's not coming to church regularly, that's a serious problem. Now, there are many reasons why you can't come. You've just had a baby, you're sick, you're housebound, loads of reasons. You're working, because you were a firefighter or doctor or something like that. But not attending church on Sundays, I think, is a serious thing. And I guess as a pastor, that's something I would want to say to people. If you considered that the Lord actually is calling us to meet together on the Lord's Day and to honour him and to set aside one day in the week. But let me say the flip side of that. Many other church-related things go on in the course of the week, in the course of the year. And none of those things has the same quality of obligatoriness. You just don't have to. It may be good to, and it is a blessing to, both for those other people who go, for example, to a prayer meeting, and to you if you attend a prayer meeting on a Wednesday night or some other time. Good to go, and yet it's not actually obligatory to go. I suppose that's why one of the things I want to kind of gradually work towards and emphasize as we start All Saints is that Sundays are at the heart of our life as a church. There's loads of other things we want to do, but Sunday's the heart of it, because that's something that we can rightly say to one another. We all ought to be there to the extent that we generally can be. Whereas Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, whatever else is going on, you just don't have to. Now think about sort of cameo character in the Gospels, Anna, described as a prophetess in the Gospel of Luke. And she's a widow and she's basically living in the temple. She's praying there day and night. And you think that is a glorious thing, and yet she doesn't have to do it. It's an expression of her particular devotion to the Lord. Now, why have I gone on for so long about things which are good but not mandatory? Because that is the nature and the definition of a free will offering. So let me just give a kind of tighter definition than putting it that way. A free will offering is an offering to God which is free. You don't have to do it. Just to say at that point, there is some sense in the Old Testament that you actually do have to bring a free will offering when you come to the Feast of Weeks, and you can read about that in Deuteronomy chapter 16. But even if there's some partially obligatory aspect to it there, I think the overall emphasis of the free will offering is that it is, surprise, surprise, free. It's something you voluntarily choose to do. Interestingly, when you look through the verses that talk about free will offerings in the Old Testament, you'll see that they're very often paired with what's called a vow offering, or the word that's sometimes used is a votive. What's the difference between a free will offering and a vow offering? Well, some ancient Jewish exegesis in the Talmud says that the difference between a vow offering and a free will offering is that a vow offering is saying, I'm going to give a sheep, and a free will offering is that I'm going to give this sheep. So if this sheep then dies or gets stolen or something on the way, then you don't have to give it. But if a sheep gets stolen on the way, then you've got to procure another sheep and give it. Well, I think that's a kind of clever distinction. I'm not convinced by it. I think if there must be a distinction, because you see it so often laid out in the scriptures. I think what's going on is that a vow offering is when you are saying to God, if you hear this prayer, if you do this thing which I'm asking you to do, then in thanks, I will give you this offering. Not that the Lord needs anything, not that it's a deal where you're saying, look, I know you need sheep to be sacrificed and I need to be saved from this awful situation, so how about we do a deal? It's not a deal. Rather, it's an expression of, I'm going to worship you, I'm going to praise you, and I'm going to do that in response to your answering my prayers by bringing you a sacrifice. A couple of examples of that from the Old Testament. I think this is important because it will cash out when we come to talk about how this plays out in New Testament Christianity. First example is Jonah as he prays from the belly of the fish. So Jonah says, those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love, but I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. He's saying, look, Lord, if you get me out of the belly of this fish, then I'm going to go back to your temple and I'm going to offer you what I vowed to give you, namely, presumably some kind of sacrifice, because he talks about sacrifices there. Another example comes in 1 Samuel chapter 1, where Hannah, who had no children, the second wife of Elkanah, says, verse 11, she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. So she's pledging Samuel as a Nazirite for all of his life, and he actually does do that. After the age of 3, he goes to live in the temple or the tabernacle at that time of the Lord. She's saying freely, vowing, Lord, if you give me this child, then I will give him to you. So I think that's the difference between a free will offering, which I suppose is just free, and you do it out of love for the Lord or concern for some particular thing, and a vow offering, which is in response to some answered prayer. Okay, let me give a few different examples through the Bible of these free will offerings. I think they basically cluster into a few different types. In the Old Testament, you see in Exodus chapter 35 and 36, The reason why God gave to the people of Israel as they came out of Egypt all of the gold jewelry of the Egyptians was not so that they could melt them down and turn them into a golden calf, which they still did. No, he actually allowed them to plunder the Egyptians so that they could offer those things as a freewill offering for the purpose of building the tabernacle. So you get this whole description of what is it going to take to build the tabernacle, the different materials that are required, and then the people offer them to Moses, or present them to Moses in order to offer them to God as a freewill offering. Similarly, you see David and Solomon accumulating all the building materials for the temple. And similarly, when they're rebuilding the temple in the time of Ezra, you see many people bringing freewill offerings of the materials that they need to rebuild and reconsecrate the temple to honor the Lord. So I guess that's the first kind of cluster, basically building projects to facilitate the Lord's worship. I think you see other ones, for example, in 1 Samuel chapter 1, which I've already mentioned, it seems that some devout families in Israel had a kind of yearly sacrifice, which was a freewill offering. If you look at what's going on in 1 Samuel chapter 1, where Elkanah's family go up year after year, it's not immediately obvious what that sacrifice would be, and yet it seems to be something that they have decided to do. Now, it's possible in that chapter that it is actually coinciding with one of the other festivals, although it's not totally clear. But in 1 Samuel chapter 20, David gives an excuse, which, although it is a lie, must be a plausible excuse, to give to Jonathan, to give to Saul. And the excuse is that he's got to go to his family's sacrifice at the time of the new moon. Now, there's, again, no reason why that should be done. It's not a required sacrifice in the law. So it must have been a free will offering that once a year, David's devout family went to worship the Lord and brought a free will offering to do that. In the New Testament, we also see examples of free will offerings, but these offerings are obviously not of bulls and goats for blood sacrifices. Rather, these offerings are almost exclusively of money. Barnabas, which means the son of encouragement, in the end of chapter 4 of the book of Acts, brings the money from the proceeds of the sale of a piece of land and lays it at the apostles' feet. It's striking to me that presumably everybody saw him do this. This was not a private gift, and yet he brings it, and that's a free will offering to support the building, not a physical building, but the maintenance of this growing church and a mission, not just to Jerusalem and Judea, but to the ends of the earth. You then see in chapter 5 of the book of Acts, Ananias and Sapphira tried to get on the same train, but doing so in a way that was profoundly offensive to God. And it's such a horrifyingly striking passage, I think, because what do? Well, they go and sell a piece of property and give a plausible part of the money, but not actually all of the money, as a free will offering. They give it to lay it at the apostles' feet. But when Peter, with the insight given to him by the Holy Spirit, accuses Ananias of lying, and then later Sapphira of lying to the Holy Spirit, of deceiving the Holy Spirit by not giving the whole amount. We're talking about somebody who's sold a house, presumably liquidated this important asset and brought a plausible chunk of it to give to the apostles. And when he says to them, "You're lying to the Holy Spirit," they fall down dead. So let's not be casual about these things. Let's not think about free will offerings. Well, I'm doing God a favor, so it's not even obligatory, but it's just a free thing. So there's no severity or seriousness about it. Well, the story of Ananias and Sapphira ought to shock us out of that complacency. The other New Testament example of a free will offering, I think, maybe this is actually more like a vow offering equivalent, is the collection for Jerusalem, which you see, well, really across several different letters in the New Testament, but especially you read about it in 1 Corinthians and in 2 Corinthians. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, we discover, verse 5, that this was actually a vow, or the equivalent of a vow. Paul says, "I thought it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead to you and arrange in advance for the gift you have promised, so that it may be ready as a willing gift, not as an exaction." So this gift, which you also read about in 2 Corinthians 8 and in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, a large gift that they were trying to pull together to support the poor Christians at Jerusalem, was meant to be a willing gift, one that they had decided to do, but it was also something they had promised to do. So Paul was not really giving them the option of saying, well, look, it was free. We didn't say that we were definitely going to do it. No, he says, you promised to do it. You vowed, if you like, that you would give this free will offering, and so that you must. In church history, we see a number of times when people have done just this, and often huge blessings and growth of the gospel results. But one quote which often comes up in connection with giving, I think has to be put into this context of free will offering rather than into the tithing obligatory giving part, is a quote from the great evangelist John Wesley. He said, "When I die, if I leave behind me £10, you and all mankind may bear witness against me that I have lived and died a thief and a robber. Now, often that's taken as a kind of blanket convicting story to say to people, you ought to completely empty your coffers. Christian giving is obliged to be to the very, very last penny, like Wesley. I think the better way to think of it is that that's what Wesley had pledged to do. He took his promises very seriously, his vows to the Lord, and he had decided, many years previous to this, that he was going to give to the Lord all of his money except for the very last penny, and he was going to die essentially penniless. And if he doesn't keep that promise, he'll have lived and died a thief and a robber. I think that's important because often the narrative, the teaching about giving, certainly the giving teaching that I received when I was a student, for example, is kind of that. What you should do is you should figure out how much you need to live on and say it's £25,000 a year. And then you should say, I'm going to stick at that level, maybe plus inflation or something for the rest of my life, whether or not I have a wife and children and parents to support and all that stuff. I'm going to stick at my £25,000 and the rest of it I'm going to give to the Lord. I want to underline, I do think that is a legitimate decision to make, a legitimate, if perhaps slightly naive, free will offering to make. But then maybe sometimes free will offerings are naive, and that's fine. The Lord can support us. He knows how to bless us. He knows how to keep us from starving. But I don't want anybody to feel that sense of obligation. A free will offering is free will, and that's the whole beauty of it. That's the whole point. So just to wrap this up then, the free will offering seems to be an offering to God which is genuinely free. You can decide to do it and you can decide not to do it. It seems in the scriptures that it typically takes place when there's a special capital project. I mean, that's a kind of slightly derogatory way of talking about the building of the tabernacle and the temple, isn't it? But you get what I mean by that. A special project that requires a great deal of outlay, and that was true also in the book of Acts at the start of the church when they were funding people to go to the ends of the earth. Free will offerings also might be in response to special appeals for the poor. Remember how Paul was sent out from Jerusalem. You read about this in Galatians, and they said to him that he must remember the poor, the very thing he wanted to do. Well, that was the poor saints at Jerusalem. And these special appeals that Paul clearly made around the Mediterranean bore great fruit for those poor Christians at the very birthplace of Christianity. I suppose there's a place as well for free will offerings reflect our personal thanks to God for answered prayer. I think that's one of the implications of that vow offering thing. Again, not that we say to God, look, I know you need this, I'll cut you a deal. It's not about that. It's saying, Lord, I'm dependent upon you for everything. Your grace is what I respond to. So be gracious to me and I'll show my response. Not that it could possibly match your kindness to me. I remember once doing a visit with a family whose child was being baptized. And they were very keen to say to me, in fact, this has happened more than once. They were very keen to say to me, oh, how much should we give to the church? And, when you're baptizing our child, we should give some money. I was very much trying to underline, I think rightly, maybe particularly in these circumstances rightly, saying, no, the very message of baptism, especially with infants, is that God's grace is free and that his grace takes the initiative. And yeah, the more I think about it, the more I think, actually, saying in response to that, look, Lord, this is what you've given to me. This is the most meager token of our gratitude and response. Could be an appropriate thing to do. But again, this has to be free. I'm about to criticize the Book of Common Prayer, so buckle up. There's a great service in the Book of Common Prayer colloquially called the Churching of Women, or the Thanksgiving after childbirth. And in lots of ways, it's a great way of recognizing that the Lord has been kind in preserving somebody through childbirth. But at the end of that service, it says, the woman that cometh to give her thanks must offer accustomed offerings, financial offerings that is. And I just want to tweak that by just a few words and say, might, perhaps even should offer accustomed offerings. But it's a free will offering, not must offer, but gets to offer. Our motivation for the free will offering is honoring the Lord and recognizing that he just keeps on giving and giving and giving, and we can barely keep up with him, but we are trying to. And our motivation is that we recognize that the world is set up, that the Lord loves and blesses those who love to give. I said this before last time, and I'll repeat it again. The Lord loves a cheerful giver, and those who are cheerful in giving find themselves with more to give, and more, and so the cycle continues. So that's the free will offering. Let me just repeat again. The tithe, I think I've made the case, is an obligation that we give to the Lord for the sake of the church. The free will offering is not an obligation. The whole purpose of it is that it's a free expression of our gratitude and wonder at the Lord's grace. Right, next time, hopefully we'll get on to the subject of almsgiving, or giving to support the poor, which I guess you can already see from this episode overlaps a little bit with free will offerings and also with the tithe. So tune back in next time to hear about that.